In the last lecture, we saw how we can retrieve our route parameters, and it was working fine, but there are ways to break this. There are cases where this approach will not work, and I will show you a typical example. On our users component, we right now always saw that we have the user ID and name we passed on our URL. Now in here, let me quickly add a router link. So I'll add a horizontal line and then add an anchor tag where I remove the ref and instead say router link. And now I will actually use this syntax with the squared brackets where I pass an array. And I want to load /users, an absolute path to load the correct route. The second element will be the ID. So this might be, let's say 10, could be a number, could be a string. And then the name, let's say Anna. So this will now construct a route which is /users/10/Anna. And this is where this array approach might be better because you can really structure this really well. And we will soon see how you can even make this more dynamic. So here I will say load Anna, ID 10, something like that, any text you like. And now let's see this here. We got this link on our currently loaded page with users free max. And if I click this, you see that the URL was updated. Now it's users 10 Anna, but the text here wasn't. And this is not a bug. This is the default behavior. And what is happening here? Do you have an idea? The behavior here, as I just mentioned, is not a bug. We load our data by using this snapshot object on the route. Now, if we load a new route, what happens? Angular has a look at our app module, finds the fitting route here, hopefully, loads the component, initializes the component, and gives us the data by accessing the snapshot here. Now, that only happens if we haven't been on this component before. But if we click this link, which is on the user component, well, then the URL still changes, but we already are on the component which should get loaded. So Angular, cleverly, doesn't reinstantiate this component. That would only cost us performance. Why would it re-render a component we already are on? Now you might say, because the data we want to load changed. But Angular doesn't know. And it's good that by default, it won't recreate the whole component and destroy the old one if we already are on that component. Still, of course, you want to get access to the updated data. And you can. It's fine to use the snapshot for the first initialization. But to be able to react to subsequent changes, we need a different approach. In our TypeScript code in ng-on-init here, let's say after we assigned this initial setup, we can use our route object, and instead of using the snapshot here, there is some params property on this route object itself. Now we didn't use that before, we had the snapshot in between. What's the difference? Params here is an observable. And now observables is something I will come to right after this section where we will take a closer look. Basically, observables are a feature added by some other third-party package, not by Angular, but heavily used by Angular, which allow you to easily work with asynchronous tasks. And this is an asynchronous task, because the parameters of your currently loaded route might change at some point in the future if the user clicks this link, but you don't know when, you don't know if, and you don't know how long it will take. So therefore, you can't block your code and wait for this to happen here, because it might never happen. So an observable is an easy way to subscribe to some event which might happen in the future, to then execute some code when it happens without having to wait for it now. And that is what params is. It is such an observable, and as the name implies, we can observe it, and we do so by subscribing to it. So you can call the subscribe method on it, and this is still called on params. I'm just bringing it in a new line to make it easier to read. And now subscribe can take three functions you pass here as arguments. Now, the first one is the most important one here. It will be fired whenever new data is sent through that observable So to put it in easier words, whenever the parameters change in this use case. So then this first argument, which should be a function here, is executed. I will use a ES6 arrow function. And here we will get the updated params as an argument. And you can set this of type params. Doesn't really make a difference. It has to be imported from @AngularRouter then though. But anyways, params will always be an object, just like here on the snapshot, which holds the parameters you defined in the route as properties. So in the function body of this arrow function, so of this function which gets executed whenever the parameter changes, here we can now update our user object. And we can say this user ID should now be params ID, referring to the params we passed here. And the same, of course, for the name. Oops, with a semicolon at the end, of course. So this will now update our user object whenever the parameter change. That's why it's inside of this callback and of this anonymous function passed to the subscribe method here. This code will not be executed when ng-on-init runs through. This code here will, so the subscription will be set up, but only if the parameters then change. Only in this case, we will exchange them in our user object. That is why with this change in place, if we now go back to free and max, we see free and max is displayed here. But if I now click this link, it correctly updates here too, because our observable fires, and we then retrieve the updated parameters and assign them to our user object. And this therefore actually is the approach you should take to be really safe against changes not being reflected in your template. Now, if you know that the component you're on may never be reloaded from within that component, as we're doing it here, then you might not need this addition. You might simply use the snapshot, because if you know your component will 100% of the time be recreated when it is reached, because there's no other way of reaching it, there is no way of reaching it whilst being on that component. If you know that, you don't need to subscribe. In all other cases, make sure to use this approach to get informed about any changes in your route parameters. In the last lecture, we learned how we can subscribe to our params to update them or to react to any changes to them and update our page if we already are on that page. Now we set up this subscription using observables, and this works fine, and you don't have to change anything here. I want to bring something to your attention though. The fact that you don't have to add anything else to this component here simply is because Angular does something for you in the background, which is super important. It cleans up the subscription you set up here whenever this component is destroyed. Because if it wouldn't do this, what are you doing here? You're subscribing to parameter changes, and let's say you then leave this component, and later you come back. Well, once you left, this component will be destroyed, and when you come back, a new one will be created. But this subscription here will always live on in memory because it's not closely tied to your component. So if the component is destroyed, the subscription won't. Now, it will be here because Angular handles this destroying of the subscription for you, but theoretically, you might want to implement the onDestroy lifecycle hook, importing it from @AngularCore. Therefore, you have to implement ng-onDestroy. And then you could store this subscription here in some property. Let's name it params subscription, which will be of type subscription. And subscription needs to be imported from RxJS subscription. RxJS is the package offering all this observables functionality. As I mentioned, it's not shipping with Angular, but Angular is using this package. So this type here, this subscription, this param subscription property is now bound to this subscription we're setting up here when calling subscribe. This returns us this subscription. And once the component gets destroyed, we could now access the subscription and unsubscribe. And again, because it's important, you don't have to do this. You can leave it as it was before, because Angular will do this for you regarding these route observables. But if you add your own observables, and I will come back to this in the observables section following this section, you have to unsubscribe on your own. And I just wanted to bring it to your attention because it's always super important to understand what's happening behind the scenes. Again, it's not necessary here, but it doesn't hurt to also do it manually too here. It won't add anything bad to your app by doing it like this. In the last lecture, we learned how we can retrieve our route params. That's awesome, and this is super important and something you will probably use a lot. Now, there are more things you can add to your URL though. You might have query parameters. These are the parameters separated by a question mark, like mode equals editing, anything. And you can have multiple ones separated with @signs. The question now is how can you pass them using Angular links, router links, and how can you then retrieve them? You might also have a hash fragment, so separated with the hash sign to jump to a specific place in your app. Loading, for example. Or maybe you don't really want to use this to jump there. You would have to add this scroll down there behavior on your own. Maybe you just want to retrieve it to use it as some extra information. Let's take a closer look at how we can pass this extra information on our links, both when using the router link directive and the navigate method in code, and how we can then retrieve that information. Let's start by passing it first. Let's say in our app module, we want to add more routes. For our servers here, we also want to add one other route, and that would be the route which allows us to edit a certain server. So we might load a server with some ID and then have /added at the end to describe in the URL what will happen in this component. And here it would be the added server component we want to load. So we added this new route, which should load this component in this added server file. Now, to be able to load this route on my servers component here, I want to hook up these links here in this list. We still have to do the same for the users component later. So here, I will add my router link and I will use the squared bracket syntax again so that I can pass an array here because I want to go to /servers. Then let's say server with ID 5. We will soon learn how to make this more dynamic. And then also add it. So this is this newly created route I want to call in this case. If we save this and we go to servers and click on this, you see we loaded service 5 added, and the same for every link, of course. Again, I will change this soon. Now let's say we also want to have some query parameter deciding on whether we are allowed to edit the server or not. So we want to add this question mark, and we don't do it by adding question mark equals something here as another element in this array. Instead, when using a link in a template, we add a new property of this router link directive. We can bind to the query params property. Now, query params, and that's important, is not a new directive. It's just another bindable property of the router link directive. And here we have to pass a JavaScript object. And on query params, we can now define key value pairs of the parameters we want to edit. So for example, say allow edit here and set this to 1. Now let's see what happens if we now click this link. If we now click any link here, you see we have question mark allow edit 1 here. So that's this key value pair we set up in this object. And of course you could have more key value pairs here, which would then be separated with the and sign in between in your link. So that's the query params property. We also have the fragment property, and that is only fragment because you may only have one fragment. Here you could simply pass a string with single quotation marks, or therefore omit the squared brackets and set this to, let's say, loading. So if we now save this, we go back to the server's page, now you see we have hash loading at the end. This is how you can add a fragment. So super easy to add in our router link here in our template. Let's now see how we can do the same programmatically. So in our home component where we already have this load servers button, let's say we want to load server 1. So here I will change this name to load server and pass 1 as an argument maybe. Adjust this method here, load server, and the ID will be passed as an argument as we just saw. And here I therefore want to navigate to servers, pass the ID. We're already seeing how this gets more dynamic. Now we're not hard coding 5 or something like this. We're using this argument here instead. And then as a last argument, add it. Now again, we still want to add query params and this fragment. So here in the navigate method, we use this object we already saw where we already added relative to. Now I don't need relative to here. Instead here, I can also set up my query params. And that again is then just a JavaScript object where we say allow added and set this to 1 maybe. And just as I added query params, I can also add the fragment here and set this to loading. Now with this, if we save this and we go back to our home page and click load server, you see we add the query parameter, allow added and set it equal to 1 and the hash fragment here. So that is how we can use query parameters and fragments on both the programmatical routing approach, calling it from the TypeScript code, or on the router link like here. Now let's also learn how we can retrieve the data thereafter. In the last lecture we learned how we can pass query parameters and fragments. Now let's make sure we can also retrieve them. So we're loading this added server component in the end. So that is probably where we want to retrieve that information. We can easily do this by going there, added server component, and you see there already is a lot of code in there. Well, everything what's happening here, however, is it's using our service to get the server with the ID 1 and to be able to update it. And definitely dive into this service file if you want to learn more about what's happening here. It's super simple though. We simply are able to get this array of servers, get a single server, or update a single server, so overwrite it. So that's not the interesting part. The interesting part in the added server component here is how we can get access to our query parameter and the fragment. We need our activated route for this. So let's inject it just like we did before. Activated route needs to be imported from the @Angular router package. So make sure to add this import at the top. And with this added, and let's say ng on init, we can retrieve our query parameters and the fragment. And just like before, there are 2 ways of retrieving it. For the first approach, we can simply access the snapshot of our route and access query params here or our fragment. Just like that. Now this might bring the same problem as with the params. This is only run or updated at the time this component is created. So if there is a chance of changing your query params from the page you're currently on, you might not want to use this approach because it won't be reactive, it won't display or allow you to react to any changes which happen after this component has been loaded. So for now, let's use the snapshot though. And let's watch the console once this reloads. Notice we already have a query parameter and a fragment. And we see both here. This is our query parameter object, where we have this key value pair mapping again, allow added to 1. And this is just a bit broken, but here you see if I make my console a bit broader, you see the loading hash fragment. So this is how you can retrieve it. The alternative, of course, is to use the route, and just like we had params as observable, we also have query params as an observable we can subscribe to, like this. And of course, we also have fragment as an observable we can subscribe to. So just like before, this will now allow you to react to changed query parameters. Now that's something we will use later in this module. For now, nothing will happen here, but it is important to keep in mind, like for params, you do have the same for query params and fragment. You don't need to unsubscribe here. Angular will handle it for you, just like it did for params. But this is how you can now get access to these extra features and how you can make sure that you don't miss the data. So now that we learned a lot about navigating passing parameters, let's improve our app a little bit by going to the users component, where we have a list of links in the end to single users. And let's add the router link here, pass an array as an argument. And here we want to target /users, and we already created our route, right? We have /users/id and /name. So we can use that information here in the users component. The second element here in this array therefore should be the ID. And since we have a for loop where we loop through all our users, we can easily dynamically add the ID here by accessing user ID. And the same for the name, the third element, the third segment in this path, the username, we can access username. This is how we can dynamically construct such a link. And you already saw this with the navigate method a couple of lectures earlier. So this is our route link here. Let's do the same for the servers. So here in the servers component, let's also replace the 5 here with server ID. We do have a server ID if we have a look at the service. At the server's service, you see we have IDs and names here. So we want to pass the ID, and we can now do this by dynamically fetching it here. And I will remove added though, because I not only want to load the added component here, I want to load this single server component instead. With my link added here, we need to add the fitting route. So in our app module here, we need to add another route where we have servers and then just ID to load a single server with the server component here. Right now we're always loading the added server component, so make sure to add this extra route. And of course, this will be loaded because we removed the added at the end. So we're not editing this anymore. This just loads the single component. And of course now, in this single server component, this one here, where we want to output our server data, we need to get that data we pass in the route path in the URL. We pass the ID there. We do have a server's service where we are able to get a server by ID. And we already do this in our server component here in Ngine init. Right now, always for the server with the ID 1. So now use your chance to update this code to do this with the ID being passed with our route. You learned everything you need for this. Time for you to do it on your own. I will give you the chance to pause this video before we do this together. So, were you successful? Let's try it together. Of course, to get access to the route parameter, we need to inject our activated route. So we learned how to do this. Add this route property and make it of type activated route, which you need to import from @AngularRouter. And now in Ngine init, you can get your ID from this activated route from the snapshot, the params object here, and then the ID, which is encoded in the URL. And now you can use this ID here to get that server. Now, if you also want to react to any changes thereafter, you need to subscribe to your params observable here and basically do the same. You get the params here, which is of type params. Make sure to import that from @AngularRouter. And once you get this, you can get a new server whenever your params should change. So here you could then access params ID like this to update the server whenever it changes triggered on this page. So with this in place, if we reload our app and go to servers, you see we get an error here, which makes sense because keep in mind on our servers component here, we still are always loading our single server component. And therefore we are also loading it if we don't have this ID available. So for now, I will comment this out. We will soon learn how we can nest another router in there to have some kind of child routing to load this route dynamically next to our menu here. So for now, I simply commented it out. If I now click on a server here, we still get an error. And now this can be a tricky one to spot. What's going wrong here? The issue is if we parse a parameter from our URL, it will always be a string because our whole URL is simply just text. So ID here will actually not be 1 in the case of /1. It will be a string of 1. So if we try to get a server by this ID, it will actually search the server, which has an ID of 1 but a string 1. However, we use numbers here. So we simply have to make sure to convert our ID to a number, and we can do this by adding a plus in front of it. And this is perfectly fine to do with that you're making sure that the ID you're retrieving is treated as a number. Of course, you also need to make sure to do this here in your observable. So convert the params here to a number too. So with that, if we now click on servers and choose a server, you see production server here, test server in this case. And with that, this is now working as expected. We now improved our app because now we got working links here, we got working links here, and we're loading the correct server. So with that, we added a lot, but we see that our app has some limitations. It would be nice if we don't load a new page with the user or the server here, but load it next to our menu in both cases. So we somehow need some nested routing, some child routes kind of, to have a router inside a router. Let's have a closer look at this in the next lectures. We improved our app quite a bit, but the issue we have is that if we click on a server or a user, we load a brand new page. It would be nicer if we would load it next to this menu, so we need some nested routing. We can also see that in the app module, we kind of have some duplication here. All these routes here start with servers and all these routes with users. So it would be nice to nest them and to have some child routes which all start with servers then here, in this case for example. Let's add such child routes. To do this, I'll go to my servers component route, to the /servers route, and I'll add another property, children. Children takes another array of routes, so now I can simply take my two other servers routes here and add them inside of this array as children. Now, servers should now be removed, because that is now always prepended at the beginning anyways, so we have to make sure to get rid of it here. And now we have just ID and ID added. So this is now already better because now we group that together. It gives us more than this visual grouping here though. You notice that on the servers here, we have the servers component as the, well, component to be loaded still. The question now is, where will the server component be loaded then? Because that is yet another child route of our servers component. And you can see that this is an issue. If we reload our app here, everything's working. If I click on test server, now we get an error. Because now the error tells us that it cannot find an outlet to load our server component in. And indeed it can't, because the only router outlet, the only hook in our code where it should load components, is in our app component here. Now that is reserved for all our routes on the top level. So /nothing, /users, users ID name, and servers. But the child routes of servers need a separate outlet because they can't override the servers component. Instead, they should be loaded nested into this servers component. And that actually is the behavior we want. So we can quickly get there by going to the servers component HTML file, and here where we load the edit page or the app server page, well here I will simply comment out all that code and instead add a router outlet here. This now adds a new hook which will be used on all child routes of the route being loaded on the servers component, which of course is our /servers route here. So all these child routes will be loaded in this router outlet place now. So if we save this and now we let this reload, you don't see anything here, but if I click a server, it's now loaded next to the menu because this is where we added our second router outlet. And this is how you can easily add child routes. Let's do the same for the user routes now. In the app module, I'll add children here, so this property which takes an array of routes. And I only have one nested route here, but that's fine, so we'll add it here. Get rid of the users at the beginning, just have then the ID and name, the two dynamic parameters, and load the user component. And now in my users component HTML file, I'll replace my app user here with another router outlet, where all the user-related child routes, or the one user-related child route we have, will be loaded. So if we save this, you now see we load the user next to it. And that is why it is super important to dynamically update the ID and so on, because the component wasn't exchanged. We were able to switch the loaded user while this old component the user component, the single user component, was already loaded. And this is how you can implement child routing, nested routes, with this children property, which then holds all the nested routes. In the last lecture, we added child routing. Let's now improve this app a little bit more. In our servers component, we have our links loading the individual servers, so the single server component, this component here, with this allow edit query parameter. So now in the server component, we should add some button where we say edit server, because right now we get no way of reaching the edit server component besides manually typing this route here, this path here, into our URL. So let's add a button to the server component. I'll add some CSS classes to make this look nice. And of course, I'll add a click listener where I say on edit. Now again, this is on a single server component. So here I'll add the on edit method. And in here, I now want to navigate to the edit server component. We learned how to do this. We need to get access to the router so that we are able to call the navigate method. So let's inject it. Make sure to also add the import from @AngularRouter. And with that injected in onEdit, we can navigate. You learned how to do this, so maybe a time to pause the video and try it on your own. This is how I would do it. I would call my router. Then of course we have the navigate method, and here we need to pass an array. And we simply want to append edit to the end of the currently loaded route. So you could of course also use /servers, the relative path, then use the ID of the currently loaded server again, server ID, and then append edit. But since we already are on this path, why not just use a relative route and just use edit? Now you learned if you want to use a relative route, a relative path here, when using the navigate method, you need to set up the relative to property here on the second argument, on this object you can pass to navigate, and reference the currently loaded route so that the Angular router knows to which route you want to navigate relatively. So with this, we should load the /edit route. We should append it to the end of our currently loaded route. Let's see if this works. If we go to servers, click on a server and click on edit, we load the edit server page. And now here we want to control on whether the user is allowed to update to edit the server or not. The issue is, you see, we theoretically have our query params here, allow edit, always set to 1 in this case. But we lose this information as soon as we click edit server. So that is something we need to fix before we can use the information there. We will fix it in the next lecture. Before doing so, let's implement the rest of the logic though. Let's say here on the servers component, where we set the allow edit query parameter, we don't always want to set this to 1, to true therefore. We want to decide on whether we want to allow the editing depending on the server ID, let's say. So only if the server ID equals 3, let's say, only in this case we want to allow edit. So we want to set it to 1, otherwise we will set it to 0. So that's just a ternary expression checking the server ID, and if it's not equal to 3, we will set it to 0. So we will set the allow edit parameter to 0. That's the first step. Now in edit server, of course, we want to be able to retrieve our query params. So here we already get the subscribe method on the query params. Now here I want to determine on whether we are allowed to edit or not. So I will add a new allow edit property here and set it to false initially. But whenever this changes here in the query parameters, I want to get my query params, which are also of type params, to be imported from @AngularRouter. And then here in the method body, I will set this allow edit equal to my query params here, equal to the allow edit ID or property we set there. And now this either is 1, string of 1, of course you could also pass true as a string here, in which case I want to set allow edit to true, If it is not 1, I will set it to false though. And in the template of this component, we could simply add a heading, let's say, where we say you're not allowed to edit if, and we can use ngIf for this, if allow edit is false, so if not allow edit, and we wrap all the rest in a new div, so all this part here, only if it is true. And now all of a sudden we would control this, but again the issue is if we click on edit server, our query params disappear, so it is always in the you're not allowed to edit mode. Let's fix it in the next lecture. Let's see how we can actually preserve our query params once we navigate again. So in the last lecture we tried to improve our application a bit more, but the issue is our query parameters are gone whenever we navigate away from our single server component to the edit server component, for example. So we want to preserve them because we already set this information at the point of time we visit a single server. Now we want to preserve this information once we navigate one step further to the edit server component. To preserve that information, we got a simple way of doing so. In the server component where we navigate, we can pass another property or add another property to this JavaScript object we use to configure our navigation. And here we get the query params handling property. Now query params handling takes a string as a value, and this could be merge to merge our old query params with any new we might add here. Now we don't add any new ones, so we can simply choose preserve instead, and preserve, which will override the default behavior, which is to simply drop them, and make sure that the old ones are kept. Now if we were to add new ones here, the old ones would actually override the new ones, so we should use merge in this case, but since we don't add new ones, preserve should make sure that we don't lose them. So now if we click on this again and click edit server, now you'll see allow edit equal to 0 is still set. And therefore on the dev server, where it is set to 1 if we click edit server, we do see the edit menu again. So query params handling here, super important, super useful to know to make sure you don't lose the information you had before. Whoa, you already learned a lot about routing. We're nearing the end. But did you ever wonder what happens if we enter something here which we don't cover? Like let's say it's just slash something? We get an error because clearly we don't have a route with slash something here. So that is something we probably want to improve. We want to do some 404 error handling. We maybe want to redirect the user to a specific page whenever he tries to visit a page we don't have. These are the topics I'll focus on next. Setting up a route which handles all routes we don't have set up, and redirecting requests. Not necessarily two topics you use together, but also not that uncommon. So let's start with redirecting. Let's say we add a new component to our application, and I will use the CLI for this with the gc for generate component command, and I'll name it page not found. The page not found component, which was added here in our app folder, in this new page not found folder. I'll get rid of the spec file, and here I will simply say in the template, this page was not found. Something like this. Now I want to render this page in, let's say, the case that we visit a certain route. I'll add it here at the bottom, where the path is, for now, something. And in this something case here, I want to load my page not found component. Of course, make sure that you added it to declarations and so on, because we're still using it in our app, of course. So with this in place, if we now save this, go back to our application and visit slash something, we of course see this page was not found. Now let's change something to not found, and let's make sure that once we add another new route, which then is something, let's say, we don't also have to add component here, but we redirect to another route, to the not found route maybe. For this, we got another property we can add to any route config here. So of course also to any of the other routes. If you don't want to specify a component to load, you can say redirect to. Now this is an alternative to component. Component loads the specific component, redirect to redirects to another path. So here you can specify any path, and the path maybe now is /not-found. So now if you do this, you see that it automatically redirected. So let me show you this again by typing /something, watch the URL, it redirects to /not-found. And all the other routes, of course, still work. So this is how we can use redirection. Now, of course, it's not very convenient to define /something here because you probably can't define all possible wrong URLs the user can enter. So a more convenient way to catch all routes which are not covered by your app is to use the double asterisk route here. This is the wildcard route, which means catch all paths you don't know. And the order is super important here. Make sure that this very generic route is the last one in your array of routes, because your routes get parsed from top to bottom here. So if this was actually at the beginning, you would always get redirected. As I can quickly show you by saving this like this, now no matter where you click, you always are redirected to not found. So make sure this is the last route here in your setup. And with this, now all the other routes work, but if you enter anything invalid here, you always get redirected to not found because now you're using this wildcard route, catching all routes which are unknown to Angular at this point of time once it reaches this line here, and which then redirects to the not found route, which displays the page not found page or component. This is how you can redirect and make sure you catch routes you're not covering right now. Whew, so a lot was covered. Let's dive even deeper. If we have a look at our application, our app module, you already see that the routing takes up some significant space in our app module. So typically, if you have more than, let's say, 2 or 3 routes, you don't add it directly in the app module. Instead, you add a new file, which is for the application as a whole, typically is called app routing module. So the apps-routing.module.ts file now will hold a second module. And I will have a whole module course section about Angular modules later in the course. There we will dive much deeper and learn how you can define and use multiple modules, use them together. This is a super easy use case here, so let's add it now. Here I will give this a name of app routing module because that is what it is. And it receives this @ng module decorator. So this is configured with a JavaScript object being passed to it. And this will be a super simple module. Now, as mentioned, I will dive deeper into this later. You can basically build your Angular app from multiple modules. This simple module here will handle all our routing related tasks. So I will cut all my routes, this app routes constant, and add it in there. Of course, now I need to make sure that all these imports here are added. So make sure to add all the imports to all these components, and also, of course, here to routes from the @Angular router package. And you don't need to add declarations here because these components already are declared in your app module. And we will soon add the app routing module to this root module. So no need to redeclare them. This would actually even give you an error. We also have to remove the router module from here, from our root module. Therefore, we can remove the imports from the router package. Make sure to import router module in your app routing module now. So to add this import here. And now we need to configure something in ng module. We basically want to add imports again. We had this in the app module too. And in imports, we want to use this router module, use for root as before, and pass our routes array to it. So just like we did before. But that alone is not enough now, because as I mentioned, we simply want to use this app routing module to outsource our routes. Therefore, we need to add our app routing module back to our main module. And for this, we need to add the exports array here. And I just can mention it again. We will dive deeper into modules later in the course. Exports simply tells Angular, hey, from this module, if I were to add this module to the imports of another module, what should be accessible to this module which imports this module? And the one thing we want to make accessible is our router module. Now here you don't call for root because you did this here. So in the first step you configured this router module, added your own routes to it. Now we simply export this configured router module. And therefore in app module, we can now import our own app routing module. So here on the imports array, we can simply add app routing module. Make sure to add the import path here. And with that, we have the same setup as before, but with a bit of a leaner app module and our routing functionality outsourced in this separate module, which is kind of a good practice to do to keep your files organized and easy to read. So, same behavior as before. If we save this with ngserve still running, we should therefore see that everything still works, and this looks good to me. But again, important to understand, now with a different setup, a bit more readable and a good practice to implement if your application grows more complex.